with a quick timeline, and then we'll get into some of your experience in a little bit. But let's start with a quick timeline. So when Trump was the president for 4 years, he did not start one single war in those 4 years. And apparently that's a pretty good feat for a president of our country. What do you think it was? Was it just coincidence? Was it the world respected us? Were we in good standing with the rest of the world? Was it good leadership? Why did we not have a war under Donald Trump?
I would say it's actually more than what you're suggesting. He did not simply decline to start any new wars. He spent most of his time trying to shut down the wars that were already in progress. When he came in, he was very surprised at the huge numbers of U.S. forces overseas. And remember that he said he would do everything in his power to terminate ISIS. And he did that as quickly and as expeditiously as he could. Now, he did it more slowly than many people liked, but we were trying to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties. And also, your audience ought to remember that the Russians were involved helping us and supported the destruction of ISIS as well, and were helpful in containing Mr. Erdogan, who was ultimately behind ISIS. So it was a difficult situation. He managed that very well, and then he drew down forces. He ultimately wanted to get all of our forces out of Syria and Iraq, but he was subverted at every turn. And I think that's what needs to be borne in mind about the Trump presidency, that President Trump, though he became president of the United States, really had no support from the federal bureaucracy. And worse, most of the people that he appointed on the basis of recommendations that came from people like former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, of all people, and others, turned out to be terrible. They were actively obstructing any change in our foreign and defense policy. So at the end of 4 years, he avoided the outbreak of any more wars, and he was instrumental in stopping, I would say, the war machine from going at Iran. If he had not been president at the time, I rather suspect we would have ended up in a war with Iran. But he was unsuccessful at shutting everything down. And that's what he was trying to do during the 70 or 80 days that I was with him at the end. He wanted to get the troops out of Syria, out of Iraq. He also wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And the reason for that was that he knew that the best time to extricate our forces from Afghanistan was during the winter. Well, that's when Afghanistan is a strange place. It's one of these places that actually has a quote unquote fighting season. You know, you have too many snows in the mountains and the mountain passes for these people to operate effectively against you, which meant that that's a good time to get out. All of that, of course, collapsed because he ran out of time. And again, he was continually obstructed by people in uniform inside the Department of Defense, as well as in the State Department and on the Hill.
I'm going to get into the war machine a little bit later because I want to talk about Adam Kinzinger and even Lindsey Graham and his comments recently. But in terms of, let's go into Afghanistan, because I think that was the next thing on my timeline here. So we see Trump leave the White House. We see Biden come into the White House. And within a year or two, like you said, Trump was looking to get out of there. Biden ends up getting out of there, but his execution and his strategy, and I'm not in the military, so I'm just speaking of what I think, did not seem to be the best strategy and the best execution that we could have had there. And obviously it cost some of our military members their lives, and it cost a lot of people, a lot of money for our military too. We left weaponry there. What do you think about Joe Biden's removal of troops and leaving of Afghanistan?
Well, again, leaving was the right thing to do. The question was always, when do you do it and how do you do it? Leaving in the middle of the summer, which is at the center of the fighting season, is probably not a good idea. In fact, we know it's not a good idea, and that's one of the reasons we never did it. So that was a huge strategic error. Had he waited a few more months for the winter to set in and then made the decision to withdraw, I think it would have turned out a little bit better. Second part is that he was not prepared to withdraw those forces. What I'm saying is that the military had been told to consider it. They had been told to look at it. But I don't think the top military leaders ever did. I think they assumed whatever happened, we would be in Afghanistan for many more years. And as a result, when the time came and he finally said, enough's enough, I want to get out, we really hadn't systematically planned it down to the last detail, with the result that you saw a great deal of chaos. And then you had some people in charge who, in my judgment, simply weren't competent. And the 82nd Airborne commander, I think, was the man on the ground. And if you look at the way he set up the forces on the way out, it was begging for trouble. We were too close to too many people that we could not control. And then finally, I think he picked the wrong place to withdraw from. You don't withdraw from Kabul airport. We could have gotten out through Bagram for the most part. We could have still retained Bagram, frankly. But we did it in such a way that we attracted all the wrong kind of attention. So, listen, it was a disaster. And by the way, no one's ever been held accountable for it.
Why do you think he pulled the trigger when he did? Was it fear? Was it nerves? Was it bad, advice? What was it that he chose that time and that airport and that place to do it?
I can't tell you with absolute specificity. I can say that President Biden, when he was vice president, was an advocate for getting out. President Biden was also an advocate for leaving Iraq through some solution, whether it was territorial or political. So I think he finally talked to his advisors and said, well, listen, this is enough. There's no benefit anymore. Let's just leave. And of course, that's what happened in Vietnam. We suddenly left, and you saw what happened in Vietnam with aircraft flying off the roof of the American embassy, people hanging on to the aircraft. We had people hanging on to the aircraft in Kabul. Neither of these withdrawals were necessarily well planned. So my assumption is that someone at the top, probably the president, simply said, that's it, I want out, tell them to pull out.
Then we get into, obviously, the Russia-Ukraine situation that's been going on for almost 18 months now we're at. Why do you believe this started when it did? And I know you're not in the Russian military or the Russian palace there, but why do you think he chose Putin to go in when he did?
I think there were several reasons. First of all, during the preceding 15 years, he had spoken at various meetings, going all the way back to 2004, 2005, about Russia's security situation. He reminded everyone that we had given our solemn promise that we would not exploit the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe to move NATO further east. Now, that's the start point. And obviously that was true. And in 2000, when we admitted Poland, that was the beginning of what the Russians at the time thought was this sort of unstoppable wave of NATO military power moving towards their border. In 2008, there was a vote, and there were several people, including the German chancellor at the time, Angela Merkel, who raised questions about the vote as to whether or not to bring in Ukraine in the future. And she was overruled, even though privately she said, look, Ukraine is not Poland. Ukraine is not Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. Ukraine is enormous in size. It's a large population, large scientific industrial base that's left over from the Soviet era. Whatever happens in Ukraine is an existential question for Russia. Russia does not want a hostile country of 35 million people sitting on its border with all of these potential capabilities emerging. But no one would listen, and we decided we're going to go ahead and do it. Then at the same time, shortly thereafter, you had this coup that was executed in 2014, where people from Washington, working closely with the CIA and others, managed to install a new Ukrainian government to throw out what was a legitimately elected leader. That resulted in this sort of radical nationalist party taking over in Ukraine, which is beholden to us. We then began selecting leaders. And it was also at the same time when the Ukrainians decided to attack the people living in the east, in Donetsk and Luhansk, these two provinces, on the grounds that they were not playing ball with Ukraine. And indeed, they were not. One of the reasons we ended up with the Minsk Accords was to address their grievances, and their grievances were very simple. We don't want to be treated like second or third class citizens inside Ukraine simply because we're Russians. We'll live in Ukraine, we'll do whatever is required, but you're asking us to abandon Russian language. You don't want us to have our own schools. You don't want the Russian Orthodox Church here. You just go down the list. And they said, we're always low man on the totem pole. We're being abused. So the Minsk Accords were drawn up to deal with that. And at the same time, you had this undeclared war that Ukraine launched against Luhansk and Donetsk that went on. By the time he finally decides to go in February of 2022, I think they'd lost over 14,000 people killed, most of them civilians, killed by random artillery strikes in various towns and cities in eastern Ukraine. And I think the reason he finally decided to go in is that he was absolutely convinced that we were inevitably going to deploy missiles, missiles like the Aegis missile system that we put into Poland and into Romania that would threaten Russia's nuclear deterrent, changing the balance of power in a very dangerous way. Instead of flight times taking, 45 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, suddenly they were reduced to 3 or 4 minutes. This is something that he wasn't going to tolerate. He also saw that this Ukrainian army was being built up with enormous funds from the West, lots of good equipment, enormous amount of training invested. And this was creating a force on his border that had only one purpose. That was to attack to the east, not only to seize Luhansk and seize Donetsk, the two so-called breakaway republics, but also to retake control of Crimea. Crimea was a place that the Russians feared we would inevitably anchor U.S. warships, and he wasn't prepared to see the United States take over the Black Sea. Again, all of these factors were in the back of his mind, and he then said, well, let's submit some new proposals to re-examine the security framework in Europe, which we would not even consider. And when he figured out that we weren't going to talk to him, he said, the only thing I can do to demonstrate the seriousness of the situation is to use military power. And so he decides to intervene in February of 2022.
So we've obviously spent tens of billions, meaning America has spent tens of billions. You have people like Tucker Carlson this week said it's a never-ending conflict. You have your Twitter people that have, the Ukrainian flag in their bios, and they're constantly pushing this war nonstop. You have people like Adam Kinzinger doing the same thing. Do you agree to keep spending tens of billions there?
Well, of course not. Just stop and consider something for a minute. Here's President Biden. If you go back to February, March, April of last year, and the statements that were made at that point, several things were stated. We will not send weapon systems with ranges that could threaten Russia. In other words, we're not going to provide missiles and rockets that reach beyond the border of Ukraine into Russia itself. We will not provide tanks. We will not provide new aircraft, F-16s, F-15s. We will not provide, just go down the list, all the things we would not provide. As the Ukrainians took heavier and heavier casualties, and everybody wants to debate this because there's so much lying about what's really happened in Ukraine. People don't know the truth. They can't even fathom that at least 300,000 Ukrainians have been killed, probably closer to 350,000. We just don't know. But we know at least 300,000 are dead. Add to that, 2, 3, 400,000 casualties beyond that, wounded, most of whom will never return to action. These are enormous numbers. We just don't know, but we know the hospitals are full. We know the graveyards are filled, so we can track these kinds of things. We know that at least 300,000 Ukrainians have died. On the Russian side, depends upon whom you want to talk to, their losses are anywhere from 20 to 50,000, of which maybe 20 to 30,000 have been killed. So their losses have always been much lower, and they continue to drop. The exchange rate is usually 1 to 8 or 1 to 5 in any pitched battle between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are losing. Some would say they've lost. They're at the point now where they could not put up a serious defense if the Russians decided to launch an offensive. As a result, Zelensky and his crew, which is essentially a puppet government of the United States, is now desperate and will grasp at anything. And so we, because we don't care to admit that we've made terrible errors in judgment, terrible errors in our strategic thinking, have decided, well, we'll throw anything we've got left at them. And you come to this cluster munition business. And at least one source, I think it was Ritter, who suggested that the reason we want to send the cluster munitions in 155 millimeter guns is very simple. we have no more conventional ammunition to send for artillery. That may be true. I don't know. But the bottom line is that